Thank you, and welcome to our second panel here. My name is Sid Bedingfield, and I'm a associate professor at the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Minnesota. Our second panel is titled Minnesota's Checkered History with Free Expression. And we have three eminent panelists here who are going to help explore this topic today. Dr. T. Anansi Wilson, an associate professor at Mitchell Hamlin Law School and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Black Life and the Law. Suki Dadarian, editor and senior vice president of the Star Tribune. She's been at the paper since 2014, and before that was a reporter and a senior editor at the Seattle Times and the News Tribune in Tacoma, Washington. And Lita Walker, a litigator in the Minneapolis office of Ballard Spahr, who has spent the past 15 years defending media firms in libel cases and helping them gain access to public records. In fact, she's representing the Minnesota Coalition on Government Information in ongoing cases now, right, that are about access to public information. Before I jump into questions, I'd like to set up our discussion very briefly here with a little background about the most notorious moment in the state's checkered history with free expression, the so-called Public Nuisance Law of 1925. That piece of legislation was really aimed at one newspaper, the wonderfully named Duluth Ripsaw. It was during Prohibition. Minnesota was a primary transit route for booze coming in from Canada. The state was marbled with corruption. Police, judges, mayors, many were raking in bribes from the bootlegging trade. In Duluth, the Ripsaw railed against this corruption in colorful and sometimes outrageous prose. In response, the state lawmakers here in St. Paul passed a measure that allowed public officials to shut down any newspaper they considered to be a nuisance in the community. City officials could just shut them down. And here's the thing, the law was not controversial at the time. The state Senate passed the measure unanimously, 22-0. And the state's largest daily newspapers did not complain. In fact, they failed to even cover the legislature's action. In Duluth, the Ripsaw went silent immediately. And 2 years later, in 1927, Minneapolis officials shut down the Saturday Press, another muckraking sheet railing against corruption. Now, the paper's editor, Jay Neer, was not a good guy, and he was a bigot and anti-Semite of the first order. But with the help of Robert McCormick, owner of the Chicago Tribune, Neer fought the public nuisance law all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in 1931, the court declared the Minnesota law unconstitutional. So in an ironic way, the state of Minnesota played a major role in advancing free expression. It provided the court with the opportunity to set the bar high for prior restraint of speech, for government censorship, a precedent that would play an important role in the so-called Pentagon Papers case in 1971. Now, Neer v. Minnesota is nearly 100 years old now. Some would call it an anomaly from the distant past, not in any way a reflection of the state's current commitment to free speech, open discourse, and government accountability. But is that really the case? Is that really true now? So let me put that question to each of our panelists here. Is it time to retire the state's checkered history label? Or do you still have concerns about free speech and access to information in Minnesota? We can start with Dr. Wilson.
I think the notion that it's a checkered history is one that is well deserved. And I think it's still a checkered present, if you will. If you think about the history of Minnesota, particularly through the lens and the eyes of Black folks, we're standing on land where Dred Scott was enslaved at the time, where Minnesota was a free territory. So how do you have freedom but a person is also not a person and now property. So there's always, I think, for Black people, particularly in the Midwest, which is hard being, as you see my Kansas City hat, from the Midwest to acknowledge, there's this notion of being in and outside of law. Inside of law insofar as we're always already able to be regulated by its disciplinary arm, but outside of law insofar as these protective foundational rights fail to fully attach to the Black body and the Black experience. And if you look at particularly at Minnesota right now, we see what happens, for example, with the disciplinary rates of children in the schools here. And when you look at what they're talking about subjective discipline, which is oftentimes not about what a student does, but about what they say. So in that way, you see the regulation of Black children's speech already happening and being, having that kind of become routine and natural in one's lives. And then we also see in Minnesota, quite frankly, interactions with the police. And we rarely talk about police encounters as speech encounters. But how one talks to the police after being cussed out, yelled at, roughed up, will often then determine what happens to you next. Do you survive on the way home? So I want us to think about free speech, not just about these kind of politically lofty ideas, but actually the right to express yourself and the right to not be regulated out of history. So I say that the title, unfortunately, still holds, but I think there is one bright spot. Last month, well, June, the Minneapolis City Council did pass a regulation, what is that? What is the word called? A resolution, rather. Regulation and resolution, right?
A little different.
That affirmed that trans people and those that engage in drag, right, are actually doing an art form and existing and doing particular types of public speech. So I did see that as a bright spot, but I think there's a lot of areas where we're still struggling, quite frankly.
Okay. Suki?
I would agree with Dr. Wilson that the checkers continue. I came here from Washington State 10 years ago and found, a good group of journalists and open government people who had worked hard to support and advocate for open government, open records laws. But almost immediately, just as an editor overseeing coverage, found immediately that the laws here were nowhere near the laws that supported me as a journalist 4 decades earlier as a reporter, particularly cameras in the courtroom. Government that, I think we were talking earlier, government that was actually bent on and more inclined to be transparent as opposed to resist requests or question requests. The notion of police records and having access to them is still very checkered. Not long ago, asking for some documents, one of our editors was talking to the police department and they said, well, which one of your reporters wants it? Both of the reporters on the team at the time were people of color. This was the Minneapolis Police Department, and today I met recently with the city to talk about our request of public documents, police reports that would be turned over to us if they even existed, and they'd be mostly blank. And they said, well, what would you like? What we'd like is we'd like you to comply with the law that you've committed to upholding, to protests where we're, just like everybody else, being pushed to the ground, our tires slashed. It doesn't feel like a welcome place. I had to ask the governor in a big public body of journalists, would he please open his calendar for journalists so that we could see where he was going every day? And he agreed, but it was under a lot of pressure. And then more recently, a reporter at Min Post, who also happens to be my husband, was chastised and allegedly reported to security after he expressed disappointment that a press conference was being ended early, and his press rights were taken away briefly. Thankfully, we have people like Lita who have helped us through this. I would say probably the biggest issue for me has been cameras in the courtroom, which I've testified twice at the Supreme Court, and they finally relented a little bit. And this is in a year where covering one police trial, we had a judge who couldn't imagine why the media needed to see any of the evidence in a case in which a police officer killed a citizen, and accused us of having prurient interest. That's an old-fashioned word, right? In the same year that that happened, or in the same time that that happened, we also saw Judge Barnett and Judge Cahill in Hennepin County agree to open the trial of Derek Chauvin to streaming. So, you know, Checkered, really bad stuff, and then some really amazing stuff. You know, in an effort to be transparent, we witnessed people on behalf of the government saying, we understand there's a trust issue and we will be transparent here. And that was an incredibly bright spot.
Okay. Lita?
So yes, I agree. It's checkered. I think what I would say, though, from the perspective of someone who litigates across the country, both defamation cases and rights of access and rights to demonstrate and reporters' privileges and sort of all the things that the media deals with, is I don't know that Minnesota stands out as more or less checkered than any other state. Yeah. I mean, I will tell you, like, I will go, you know, I'll be, you know, Georgia. I don't think Georgia's progressive, but they have cameras in courts. And here we are, you know, in the bold North, where we think we're all, you know, liberals, or most of us are liberals, and we don't have cameras in courts. And so I'm constantly surprised in going to other states. Some of them have good things that I don't expect, and then I'm sometimes glad to be back in Minnesota where we have other things. And so I think it's, you know, the law develops in curious ways, based on the facts of a case or an event that happens that spurs people to action, like our rule change on cameras. And so I think it's just, it is checkered, but I don't know that it stands out as better or worse or more consistent or less consistent than other states.
Okay. I want to come back to the anti-protest laws, the efforts really here in Minnesota since about 2014, and the emergence of Black Lives Matter as a national movement, and one here in Minnesota. There have been efforts to try to regulate and even intimidate protests and dissent. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, on the effort here in the state to do that. Do you think it is beyond other states? Is it more aggressive? What do you think?
No, it's Minnesota and nice, right? I think that Minnesota has a way of doing things. And it's really interesting. I think those of us from the Midwest, particularly the upper Midwest, have this notion that we're so different from the South. I think that, you know, in Minnesota, they just can sometimes kill you nicely, right? Do it slowly, make it sweet. And so I think that what happens in Minnesota when we're thinking about protest, particularly with Black people and Black rights, the impulse across the country is almost always violence. It's never to sit and listen to the Black child or the teenager or the elder that's asking these questions. It's irritability always already, right? There's just always type of disciplining arm that is happening. And so I think with Minnesota, we have not seen really bold legislation to create a norm in this state, and particularly in the Twin Cities, that says, wait a minute, people have a right to protest, and we should all be absolutely outraged if one person's pushed over by a police officer. If one person is cussed at by an officer, we expect it. You go to a protest prepared to be harmed. That's ridiculous, right? In the previous panel, we were talking about the norms that Europeans have. This would be a complete outrage. I mean, if this was France, the whole country would be shut down in that way. And so here, I think we really have to think about, like, what does it mean that it is so routine to see Black youth and Black elders on TV beaten by police officers, that it's not something we bat an eye about? It's something that's really sad, but it's not something to complete a constant outrage, because if it were, we'd probably have daily heart attacks. So I think we have to think about that. And the other piece I wanted to talk about with this, though, not just the protest, but you mentioned Georgia earlier as a comparison. And it's funny because they do have the kind of, you know, the cameras in the courtroom, but they also use rap lyrics to convict people in RICO charges. And so, so it's really interesting, but I haven't seen any legislation on that in Minnesota at all to say, wait, hip hop is an actual art. They should not be a body of evidence against someone for expressing themselves. So
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of things, particularly concerning Black people, that go under the radar just because they've always been that way.
Yeah. Suki, in terms of the protest laws, how have those laws affected journalists? Do you worry that those laws are going to inhibit journalistic coverage of protests here in the state?
Well, I think our coverage was inhibited.
Yeah.
And just as protesters were inhibited,
Yeah.
and we were all sort of being wiped with the same
Yeah.
brush. And even when you showed your press credentials, they would say, I don't care that you have press credentials. You don't have credibility with me.
Mhm.
And so in some cases, we were targeted because of it. And at one point, during one protest, all of the journalists who had passes, we made them really huge so the police could see us, but that didn't really help. They were all pushed down to the ground, face down to the ground. Then they were pulled up, and then they were paraded in front of the police, and then their pictures were taken in a surveillance sort of way. And they apologized later, right? But the feelings of the individuals on the ground, you can't replace that. You can't. It's hard to send them out the next day. It's hard for a protester to go out the next day and feel confident in what they're doing after something like that. And people were being paraded onto buses into arrest
Yeah.
situations, and there was no logic. It was don't be over here and don't be over here. So where am I supposed to go to cover this? And our journalists were out there, and many of them kind of huddling together, journalists in groups, to try and protect each other.
Famously, CNN had a correspondent arrested
Right.
on camera during a live shot.
Yeah,
As-
they knew he
as
was a
well.
journalist.
Yeah, this idea of he didn't know where he could actually work and how that would play out. Lita, any thoughts on this, or?
Yeah, I mean, my concern with this is, on some level, 2020 was like nothing I'd ever seen.
Yeah.
And many of us, like nothing we had ever seen between the pandemic and George Floyd's murder and the unrest. And so I was working on behalf of a lot of journalists when they were being arrested and detained. And we had both in 2020 and then again when Daunte Wright was killed in 2021, lots of calls with high-level officials, including the governor. And I will tell you, I mean, the high-level folks get it, and I believe them when they apologize and say this is not what they want Minnesota to stand for. But my concern is that, the message is not trickling down. And in a crisis situation, when everyone's panicking, and police shouldn't panic, they should be trained not to panic. But when everyone is panicking, these rights are sort of the first thing to go. We're really lucky we got in 2021 a federal court order in the Goyette case. The ACLU represented a journalist, and really strong language from a federal judge enjoining law enforcement from doing certain things. And that's sometimes, I mean, the experience of trying to navigate the demonstrations and the Chauvin trial, and ultimately getting cameras in that trial, I think one lesson I learned from that was when you can collaborate and educate people and talk to them and make them feel like you're partners in bringing transparency to the public that needs to understand what's happening, like that goes a long ways. You can get a lot done in a way that you can't when you march into court and pound on the table. And so I do think sometimes a less adversarial role can be very successful. But the exception I draw, the caveat to that is, I think sometimes when it comes to protecting demonstrators, you just got to sue people. And that's what snaps heads to attention. I mean, the other thing I'll say about,
Yeah, there you go.
I mean,
A litigator speaking.
you got to get a federal court order, and then, lo and behold, then they do some training, right? Why didn't they think of that before? I mean, and this will be a pivot, so I don't know if you're ready to go there yet, but what was truly ironic to me about the abuse of journalists, including the photographs that they took of journalists, which we immediately called the governor about, and he's like, no, we don't know why they were doing that. That's inappropriate. I think we said, can you delete them? And they actually said we can't because of the Data Practices Act. But the other thing that's really ironic and sort of appalling about the Data Practices Act and how this went down is I represented one journalist who was really mistreated. She was a woman of color. Felt like she was asked as she was being thrown to the ground and saying, here's my credential. She was asked, do you even speak English? I mean, it had obvious racial overtones. A lot of journalists don't want to become the story. And so they are loath to report this and hold officers accountable. And there's a real tension there. And I think that's the people who we saw sue and get those great court orders, they were freelancers who had less to lose and didn't have mainstream media sort of backing them. And I think that's not a coincidence. But to kind of complete the point I started rather than go off on a tangent. So this woman was really abused. She opted not to file a complaint. But when a high-ranking official in this particular law enforcement agency heard about what happened to her, he filed a complaint to his great credit. And it went through a full administrative investigation. And the officer was disciplined. He was given a oral reprimand. And so she was able to find out at that point under our data practices law, when discipline happens, everything becomes public, the complaint, the investigation, the discipline. Had it gone through that process and he had not been disciplined, not even the journalist who was thrown to the ground would have known what happened. And that's a real problem. Her photo, by the way, her photo was taken too, and it was put in some like binder this particular agency kept of like people to watch for on the street, which was really, really creepy.
Yeah.
They also wouldn't, I don't think, delete that because of the Data Practices Act. So there you go.
Troublesome though, that you mentioned, I think both of you mentioned that you had higher ups in positions of prominence who were apologetic, who said they wanted to do the right thing and maybe even did take some steps toward doing the right thing. Why doesn't that trickle down through the system? Where is the disconnect here? And I think that gets at this disconnect between the sort of perception of Minnesota nationally with its public figures saying many of the right things and the actual situation on the ground here. What's driving that disconnect? Why doesn't it go down through the system? Thoughts on that? I know you may not have an answer.
Yeah, I'll just answer really quickly. I think with regards to police departments in general, and they're not alone, but maybe it's especially acute there. There's just animosity toward the media. They just view them as the enemy, and that's a cultural problem. Yeah. And until that cultural problem is fixed, you will continue to see journalists abused. I think just outside of police departments and public agencies in general, they do not view transparency as part of their core mission. They view it as a hassle and something we have to do on the side when we're not doing our actual job of processing your driver's license or, getting the environmental permit out or whatever. And I think, again, that's a cultural thing. Like, people need to understand that as a public servant, transparency is like a core mission of your job. And that's just not how people think of it.
I think it's something about the privacy and protection of people. And in fact, I think there was something in one of the laws around giving public officials, some privacy to do their work. Mm-hmm. And that makes sense, doesn't it, Minnesota? Like, they have to, it's a very protectionist sort of approach, whereas there isn't an oath of transparency. And we have to trust them they're doing the right thing for the right people. And we found in stories that we have done that look at how the state handles children, child protection, elderly protection, people who are disabled, and on and on. The strategy is similar. And even trying to get that information it's not given to us, at least in a database. We might have to go piece things together record by record. But it's because they think that they're protecting those people. Right now, in the state of Minnesota, if a child is killed while under supervision of the state, the report is sealed. Even if the child is no longer alive, I don't know where the privacy is there. How do we get better? How do we improve? How do we learn from our errors?
Right.
And I think it's a very kind of protectionist sort of approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is, and I hate to kind of be this person, but I guess I'll be that person tonight. But the state always protects its interest, its ability to do harm,
Yeah.
right? And that's just the reality. I mean, look at qualified immunity, right? So, I think we can talk about this. And you gave some great examples. We think about what happens to disabled folks. We think about what happens to poor people. We think what happens to women of color, right? Within the state, particularly within police custody, but also within protective child services and things. So there's always a harm there. And I think that particularly when we're thinking about protesters and people of color, you can't name, at least I can, and I've a law degree and a PhD, I've been citing this for a while, but I cannot find a moment in history where the police were on the right side of a social movement, right? Where the police were actually protecting protesters and these kind of large scale movements, right? There's one-off things that happen, but instead of harming them, and so I think that's something we have to think about, is that the precedent in America is violence against speech, is violence against protest, is protection against transparency that could allow one to be disciplined for doing harm. And when we think about, that creepy binder you were just speaking about, how different is that than COINTELPRO in the 1960s? So, I mean, these technologies that often begin with disciplining Black people in particular, and in Minnesota, we have to talk about Indigenous folks as well, it gets democratized. And so the harms that happen to the least regarded among us always become democratized over time, and we forget to remember that we could be next. And I think that's something very, very sad that we have to continue to say out loud, but we're now in an era where there's regulations in other states about what things can be taught in schools. And so we talked a little bit about education for officers and training, but I don't know how many trainings the Minnesota Police Department has gone through, my Lord. But I think a part of this is that type of building of an education about what rights and what values do we have as a nation. What is the true history and not the cherry tree history, as someone said earlier, about the United States? And if we can't tell that story, if we can't build those values, if we can't be uncomfortable in 5th grade and 7th grade and in college, we're never going to get to a point where we have community protected values against state violence, against individuals.
Go ahead.
Throw in one thing. I think there's, to Suki's point about this urge to protect privacy or protect children, I mean, I think there's like the unconscious things people are doing that are harmful. And then there's the things they say publicly to justify their actions, right? And I do think sometimes it's, we want to protect children's privacy, or we want to give public employees room to make small mistakes. They shouldn't be constantly under a microscope. And those are fair points. I think this is a nonpartisan issue though, right? And just because we think we live in a progressive state or we're Minnesota nice, like we don't escape this. And I'll come back to the police disciplinary data and really one of the reasons it's so hard to change the law on the state statute on whether you can get complaint data about public servants, including police officers, is because of the DFL party. It's very pro-union. And the public employee unions come in and they say, well, we want to protect our employees, and the DFLers fall in line. And we think progressive means transparency, and they think progressive means pro-union. And in certain situations, those things are very much at odds.
Yeah, fascinating. In our earlier discussion, you talked about systemic problems with the Minnesota Data Practices Act and how it works, how the system works, and sort of the built-in bias toward privacy as opposed to access. Talk about that a bit.
I mean, the main reason,
the
big privacy thing comes up with personnel data on public employees. There's one statute in Minnesota that speaks to all personnel data. It doesn't matter if you work at the Hennepin County Library or if you carry a gun, right? You're treated the same. And there's most personnel data is not public. The real underlying challenge with our Data Practices Act, some states call them an open records law or like a state FOIA, we call it the Data Practices Act, is that the data subject can sue also if data is wrongfully disclosed. And that's somewhat unique. And it puts, it very much makes public agencies feel like targets, I think, that if we'd like to disclose this, we'd like to have discretion to disclose this, but under Minnesota law, we don't. And if we screw up, then we can get sued by the data subject. And it creates these weird disincentives that not every state has.
Okay. I just wondered on the Data Practices Act, did you have any insights on how it has affected your journalists and your efforts to get information from governments?
Well, I would say that we have been lucky. The Star Tribune is willing to fight for information and work with other news organizations and other organizations in the area to battle closures, and we have a great lawyer in Lita. But when I was in Washington, if you could prove that you were denied information that you should have gotten, the government agency could then be held liable for all of the attorney's costs and even some punitive damages, or I don't know what the actual phrase is for that, but you can actually profit by suing an agency if it's not complying. And so I think, when you talk about the legal balance of power, that changes it in some states.
Right.
And you can in Minnesota too. You can recover fees. But I will tell you, judges award pennies on the dollar. So it's just, it's expensive.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to underscore something you were saying earlier too, right? The difference between a librarian and someone that carries a gun. And if we were talking about any other type of employer, public citizens are public employees, it would be ridiculous to say we're not going to go through a background check, or if you get arrested, we're not going to be able to look at it as your employer. And so I think that sometimes with some of our public institutions, we have the relationship backwards, right? We should realize that folks are working for people. And I mean, we can go back and talk about George Floyd. If we knew, all the things that Derek Chauvin had done, might be a different scenario today. Right. So I think this is really crazy. It's the idea that someone has the legal right, and there's not actually right. So don't let me not get too loose of the tongue, but the kind of basic assumption of a legal right that if an officer kills you, they're assumed most of the time to be the one in the right, protect and serve. And so there should be a higher standard there. Right. But we don't have that. And it's strange, but it's something, again, that has become routinized, that we've accepted as normal.
Right. I wanted to back up a little bit, pull back a little bit, and talk about the emergence of digital technology and the internet and its impact on these issues over the last 2 decades, really, both in terms of police releasing information, body cam video, for example, in the Chauvin case and the Darnella Frazier video, and how that actually impacted the case. If you remember, the first release from the police was incorrect. I mean, it was a misrepresentation of what happened. I just wondered if we could take all these issues we're discussing and sort of bring them, what impact has the internet and the global reach of the internet really had on these issues here in Minnesota, from your perspectives?
I think that it's forced a lot of people to bear witness. It's forced a lot of people to be honest with themselves about things that they may have known but didn't want to say out loud, or didn't want to believe, even about their own assumptions about other people, assumptions about the police, assumptions that we have with people of other races. So I think in many ways people have made this conversation about a national racial reckoning. I don't really believe in that. But what I do believe in is that people have had individual reckonings, right? And they continue to have them because they go on Twitter and they think they're going to look at a funny, nerdy political tweet and they're seeing police violence.
It becomes undeniable.
It's in your face, and people are being forced, thanks to the media, right, to respond to this clip. What do you do about it? And we have, now issues where you will interview a governor and the governor can't just apologize. Can't just say, I instructed this agency to do that, or I tried to push a bill. What did you do? Because there's another person dying today, right? So I think social media And videos and recording have been great in that way, but then there's also the reverse, right? You're recorded, and as they were talking about earlier, you'd like the right to be left alone or the right to be forgotten, particularly with these police body cameras. If you're downtown Minneapolis, you walk over by Target, you're on camera, right? Everything you say is now recorded, and so there's a question of privacy that also allows people to become victimized in other ways. So I think it's very, very complicated, but I think if I had to say on balance, what is this? I'm probably good for now, but terrified for the future, particularly with AI.
That's true.
I would agree. You know, when the police release a statement that's not true, and the reporter tweets something saying, I'm asking questions about this and I haven't gotten answers, and then people are sending him information that they have in real time, and the story changes hundreds of times during the course of the next few hours, it's because there is this super highway of information. And it can cause problems if it's sending everybody in a wrong direction, or it can help get to the truth faster. And it's interesting seeing how people respond to incidents and who they trust and where they go and how people respond to it. You know, body cam video is being released more readily now because there might be other cameras nearby too, right? So I think it is mixed. And I also think just because you have a lot of video doesn't mean you know the truth.
Right.
And so what is the
Video can lie
truth?
too sometimes.
And I think the truth is elusive, and I think people, how do you decide what to believe? And I think that can be super overwhelming for the average human who isn't going to spend all day on Twitter or TikTok trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the internet and social media, but for Darnella Fraser's video, Derek Chauvin would never have been arrested. Right? So many, many good things about the fact that everyone has a phone in their pocket and we can speak truth to power. But I'm convinced as a litigator who seeks access to courts, and put aside state records and agency records, which are governed by statute, but when you march into court and you ask for access to a body cam video that's on file, or you are protesting a gag order, or you want to know the names of the jurors, right? I'm convinced that social media is the #1 threat to the sort of robust court access that we've experienced in this country since its founding. And I'll give you an example. So George Floyd was murdered Memorial Day weekend, and Derek Chauvin's arrested, and it was in July when I think his co-defendant Lane filed a motion to dismiss, and he attached the official body cam footage to his motion to dismiss. And the court said, well, the public can come in and watch it at the courthouse, but I'm not going to make copies available, because the court didn't want copies on the internet of this. I mean, it's a traumatic thing to watch, and that comes from a good place, that why do we need this all over the internet? Of course, Darnella Fraser's was all over the internet. So that happened, and at the same time, the judge issued a gag order on the trial participants, but it was a really broad gag order. And it basically read literally, it prohibited any employee of the state of Minnesota from speaking to the press. And so we went in and we challenged both. And when we were challenging the gag order, we said, look, Your Honor, this could be so broad as to limit the ability of state legislators from talking about this case and expressing opinions on this case. And we listed some examples. We had no idea, I think Suki was at this hearing, we had no idea that coincidentally one of the state legislators we listed happened to be Judge Peter Cahill's from his district. And so we get to the hearing where we're going to ask for access to body cam and say, take down this gag order. And before the hearing starts, and I should mention that this was like within a week or a month or something of the federal judge. Remember the federal judge who had sentenced a man, and then he came to her house and killed her son. So that had just happened. And here's Judge Cahill facing, you know, what at the time felt like the trial of the century. Tensions are running high, the city is burning, and I've named his legislature in this public hearing. And before the hearing started, he called me to the podium and he accused me of trying to dox him and to tell people where he lived so they would go protest his house. And I was astounded and mortified, but I tell this, that's not what we had done, and I convinced him it was just a coincidence, and if I wanted to dox him, I knew how to do it, and it wouldn't have been that way. But, I mean, it struck me that, like, judges are so afraid. They're so afraid of what's going to get on social media and drive some nut job to do something in the real world. And it's not an unjustified fear, but it is the biggest threat to our continued access to judicial records.
Add one thing to that.
Please
So jury selection began. There were lots of conversations about what we could and could not show on camera, and the jury selection was happening live. It was streaming around the globe, and our reporter, we were tweeting or reporting about, oh, you know, juror 35, you know, from Edina, a broker or something is on the jury or not. Someone somewhere, I think maybe on talk radio, accused us of sharing private information about jurors, that we were doxing the jurors. That went crazy on Twitter. The police, the crime editor, received mail at her home threatening her and her family. A number of reporters had to go off social media because they were being doxxed themselves for reporting on something that happened in open court that was being live streamed. And somehow truth didn't matter in that situation. So, you know, we understand why the judge was perhaps feeling that way.
You two are deeply involved with issues here in the courts and in reporting on the courts in Minnesota. And Dr. Wilson, you are also following it as well. But I just wonder if you think that cameras in the courtroom are going to come to Minnesota, or are we going to see that spread here after the Chauvin trial? Was that a breakthrough that is going to turn opinion toward cameras in the courtroom, or was that a one-off?
No, I don't think it's a one-off. I mean, we have a rule change post-Chauvin that goes into effect in January. And I mean, pick your high-profile attorney, whether it's Keith Ellison or Chief Judge Patrick Schultz or, you know, Cahill or Chief Judge Barnett in Hennepin County. To a person, they say, Mary Moriarty, to a person, they say, I was against cameras, I watched Chauvin. They're a good thing. We should have them. And the Supreme Court heard that, I think, and changed the rule. It's not a perfect change. It's still, what it does is it takes the power away from the parties, and it gives discretion to the judge to allow cameras even if the parties don't consent. Judges, some think cameras are a good thing. Some think cameras are a bad thing. Some judges are still going to say no. But I think what this gives us is a chance to have more than two experiments. We had Chauvin, we had Kim Potter. We've had two experiments and they worked. And now we can have more. And I think some momentum can be built.
Suki, you were shaking your head there.
I've been here 10 years, and now the door is opened a bit in January. So we'll see how that goes. But it's slow, and it's not a system where there's support throughout the system. One thing I've noticed is when you have individuals in government who do believe in transparency, they can make it work. But if the system doesn't, then it doesn't. And so
people can throw up roadblocks.
Right. So, you know, to a degree, that court ruling was important because it was a system ruling. And it wasn't just a couple of judges who wanted to be transparent. But I think it's a small step.
I think more transparency, like cameras in the courtroom, releasing a body cam video, will improve the behavior of law enforcement in terms of the Black community and Native American community? Will it improve? Or is that just wishful thinking?
You know, if I had the solution for how to improve law enforcement's behavior, I
You
don't know that I'd
would've-
be sitting here right now. No, I think that's helpful. But I do worry as far as the courtroom, if we know we already have racial bias in policing and in prosecuting, then what does it mean if those images or those videos or those clips can be searched for that person, right? It follows you forever. It's not just a horrible thing that you might have been acquitted of or you might have been convicted of, but now it stays forever.
Could be on camera.
Yeah, the acquittal could be on camera, but the arguments that are made, the evidence that comes in the courtroom, right? People form their own decisions, and those decisions aren't just the historical, you know, your little town square, whoever wants to drive up to the courthouse and be nosy that day. Now they're anyone that can wants to Google your name. So I do find that a bit concerning, but I think as George Floyd showed, it goes both ways. So it's a very scary thing, but I think in terms of police behavior, I think it nudges folks in the right direction. Folks don't want to be called out. You know?
I mean, to that point, I should say, one of the reasons cameras have taken so long to arrive in Minnesota is because of this concern about the fact that the criminal justice system disproportionately targets people of color.
Right.
And it is just another burden piled on top of them to have the worst moments of their lives televised. I mean, you know, look at the show Cops. Like, what has that done for racial justice and eliminating racism in the United States, right? It has probably confirmed a lot of people's unfair biases. And this has been, for many years, the argument raised, including by former Supreme Court Justice Alan Page. And when Suki and I were testifying at the Supreme Court, the justice who had the most questions and was the most critical of this, and I think dissented from the decision to change the rule, was asking these questions, like, why should, you know, people of color who are already targeted by this system now have to have cameras in there? I mean, my argument is, if this is our system and it's unfair, people should see the unfairness. But that assumes then people are ready to correct the unfairness. And I think her concern is they won't be. They'll
Right.
just now see it and have these
It
biases
confirms it.
confirmed.
And I mean, there's so much data about the TV show Cops and how it's changed attitudes on race and policing. And to your point, I mean, folks don't want to be the example either, right? I don't want to be the one that now, after I've gone through this harm, I'm your educational moment, right? And so it's hard because I don't know what the balance is. And I think it takes a lot more thinking, and maybe this is something that communities get together and decide, right, in these robust debates. And it's not just, you know, a court ruling. Maybe there does need to be more public conversations about this.
Okay. I want to go to questions now from the audience. I just saw a hand go up, so I'll turn to a question here. Well done.
It may be, excuse me. This may be on my mind because earlier this year, I visited the grave of Elijah Lovejoy, who was the abolitionist editor who was murdered in 1832, trying to protect the fourth of his printing press.
Alton, Illinois, right?
Alton, Illinois.
I think it's working now. I thought it was working.
Okay.
There you go.
Whenever we see upheaval, we see the press targeted. We saw it with the Alien and Sedition Acts. We saw it with Elijah Lovejoy. In Minnesota, we had the murders of Howard Guilford and Walter Liggett, working journalists killed for doing their jobs. We've seen the violence that happened to protesters. How concerned are you that we're in a time where the press is vulnerable to violence for exercising their freedom of expression?
Who wants to go first? Maybe start with Suki.
Well, I think we are there. I mean, people have shot up newsrooms and you know, even journalists who were covering the protests were assaulted by protesters. And not too long ago, we had a raid on a newspaper editor's home. And so that's happening. Is it happening more? I don't know. I'm thinking of Jane's comments earlier. Is it worse? Is it better? Is it the same? It feels more common today than it did 10 years ago. And I think perhaps supported by some people who have been coached not to like the press, or who, because we are polarized, are you the right press or the wrong press? And I think people are less likely to trust us now. And so might there be more public support for shutting us down? Possibly. But I also think that, there are a lot of strong organizations and unions of journalists and civil libertarians out there who are watching. But I think it's maybe more scary for some of the individual journalists than the institution of journalism.
I just want to say about that too. I think it's important too to think about, the violence that Black journalists have always gone through, particularly those that work for Black presses, and to your point, don't have that large institutional support, that are going out and asking questions of police officers and seeing there's no patrol on their streets anymore, or there's now a lot of patrol on their streets, or they're being tailed. So I think it's important for us to kind of keep those conversations in mind, because for the Black press, this has always been the case, right? There's always been folks that got killed over these things.
Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898. They burned down the paper. That was the target.
Exactly, and to your point, the abolitionist press here too, right? The abolitionist journalists and people that are, and to your point, the individuals that are working on the information that's important to vulnerable communities are often the first to be targeted. And quite frankly, in American history, have never not been targeted.
That's true. One point, I'm going to come to your question. I'm going to add one point.
I think your view is excessively domestic and insufficiently Marxist. You keep making these references to America, but surely you wouldn't endorse what goes on in France. It's just as racist as it is in the United States. And I think that's true pretty much around the world. I think the problem is police are police. We've had murders of Black individuals by Black police officers. Inevitably, the race was not who they were. What they were blue. And I think there's an issue about how police are trained and educated, not only in the United States, but internationally.
Yeah,
and the whole nature of the role of police officers who don't protect quite as much as we'd prefer.
Well, I would first say, I don't think Marxism is evolved enough for what I actually believe, but I'll still take it as a compliment. But I would say, as far as, being, expressly and excessively focused on the United States, that is the title of the topic, right? We're talking about the state of Minnesota. Right. But I would also note that most of the elite police forces in the world are trained by the United States. So I think that when we're talking about, whether we're talking about France, or we're talking about Israel, or we're talking about all these places that have really terrible racial issues, they're trained out of the thought of the United States and through our special training programs, and we fund a great many of them. So I think that when we're talking about America, we're almost always already talking about the rest of the world in terms of policing. And I would agree with you. I mean, there are sometimes, like in Memphis, right, the Black police are doing even more violent things. But I would also argue that anti-Blackness is something that Black people are not immune to. So to your point, yes, there is a blue gang, but I think the unifier is not the color of the uniform. I think it's the fact that anti-Blackness is oftentimes the smog we all breathe.
Well, maybe.
Right. Yeah.
Jury's out. We'll find out.
Wanted to add one point about the threat to journalists in this age that we live in, particularly the digital age. There is this question of who is a journalist, who is the press now. To say that I hate the press, what does that really mean, and who might be attacked? Also, the last panel had a robust discussion about this and talked about Trump and his campaign against the press, and in terms of the enemies of the people. And I thought, this is really a part of an international effort. You see populist leaders around the world, and the first thing they do is attack the institutions of liberal democracy. And that's what Trump was doing in his sort of haphazard way. Others were doing it in a much more systematic way and Hungary, in Turkey to some extent, in other countries around the world where they're going after institutions and the press, an independent press and an independent judiciary being chief targets of that. And so I think that's where, there's a larger systemic threat to the press coming from a populist movement in this country, if you will. So I'll just add that. Professor Kirtley.
I have a question for the panel because I'd like to get back to kind of where you began, which is talking about Near versus Minnesota. Something that I think probably at least some people in this room are not aware of is that Minnesota is one of the not quite 24 states that still has a criminal libel statute. And I think that oftentimes those of us that are in the mainstream media associated with it say, they're never going to come back after the Star Tribune, they were coming after Pioneer Press. Who do they come after? They come after bloggers. They come after non-mainstream media. And it just seems to me that a state that prides itself on being so progressive and everything really has to ask itself, do we really want people to be facing criminal fines and perhaps jail time because of what they have to say? So I'm just curious to know what the panel thinks about that.
When was the criminal libel law last invoked?
It's actually not been that long ago, Hal, because it's mostly brought against individuals, right?
Right.
Yeah, I'm against it. We.
Me too.
I'm shocked.
Yeah, that's not for me.
My question is, why are we so sanguine about the fact that we have this criminal libel law sitting on our books when other states have either repealed it or the
Right.
state Supreme Court has struck it down?
Yeah, one or two bad elections and it could be put to use.
Yeah,
right?
and I mean, sadly, I think the answer is that it takes resources and coordinated effort and money and lobbying to challenge these things. And so, and I'm not saying this is a good thing, I just think it's the way it is. Like, if they're not coming after the people who have those things, there is no mobilization to get the law changed.
That's right.
There should be, but that's why I think there hasn't been.
It's that old Frederick Douglass quote, right? Power concedes nothing without a demand. And folks that don't have a voice don't have the power to make a demand.
Right. What? No.
Yeah, Thaddeus Miller again.
President
Listening
Miller.
listening to your conversation, I'm reminded of the fact that speech has never been free. We assume it has been because it is a principle that we all believe in and want to see it implemented in the truest possible way. But speech has always been contextualized. Speech has always been identified in terms of who gets it and who doesn't, and in what situation does it exist, and for whom does it exist. So, you know, I like the conversation we're having. I think it's a necessary conversation, but I think within this country, we really need to be at least acknowledge the fact that speech has never really been free in the way in which it was intended to be free. And I want to bring up something else, and I apologize for breaking it up, but I think I need to bring it up because you're the press, except for Nancy. I need to bring this up. When you as the journalist write, you need to also be truthful in what you write. Because while you get threatened for writing the story, those of whom the stories are written about get threatened for being in the stories when the story isn't true. So it's a relationship that has to be shared, understood, and realize the complexity, that there are complexities involved in that situation. But we don't want journalists to be threatened, God forbid. We know that it happens. We know that journalists have been killed. We also don't want the subjects of the stories that you write to be threatened and possibly killed. We just had an academic freedom thing at Hamlin last week, and I learned that one of our panelists has left the US because of credible threats against her life, because of things that she's written. So, that is a concern. And that's the reason why I said with the last panel, while this might be the way that things have always, but these are not new situations, because it's not new, doesn't make it dangerous. Doesn't make it something we shouldn't pay attention to because the consequences are too grave.
Really well said. When we tell difficult stories and somebody has agreed to tell their truth, one of the biggest responsibilities and challenges for us is, especially if it's a difficult story, is how we handle that. And is it an anonymous source? Can we protect them? Do they know what's going to happen to the story? Today, the story can go anywhere, right? The story a few decades ago maybe didn't go very far. We've done some stories recently about people who shared their truths who hadn't ever shared them with their families. And you don't know, you think about the risk around you, but you don't think about the risk that you can't see. And I think that's a challenge for all of us. It's a burden for journalists who want to tell the truth about a problem, but will telling that story put someone at harm. And how do you navigate that risk? And it's, I feel like that risk is growing.
I think you raise an excellent point too. And I know my journalist clients think hard and take a lot of care with this. But as you both were talking, I'm realizing that some of the things that journalists could do to protect sources, they are disincentivized to do by the law, right? So I'll give you an example. I represent mainstream newspapers like Star Tribune, and I also represent more think tank organizations that call out corruption in third world countries and name and shame, and they have whistleblowers there that they rely on. And sometimes if a whistleblower is going to be jailed and tortured in some far-flung country for talking to my client, they will financially support him and get him out. From a journalistic perspective, that's a little sketchy. That sounds like paying a source. And if that comes out in a libel case, like, oh, you wrote this defamatory report about me and you got this fact wrong, and this fact came from a source, and you paid for him to fly out of the country and you put him up in an apartment for 3 months because he gave you this information, like, the law does not look well upon that. And so what journalists might want to do that's the moral thing can be in tension with what they feel like they can do from a legal perspective. And I think we need to think about whether the law should accommodate for that.
I wanted to return to the first part of your comment, Madam President, about the Constitution. And so I teach constitutional law. That's my thing. And the first day of school, I'm like, welcome to constitutional law, civil liberties. You have no rights. You don't. You think you do, and you don't. And by the end of this class, you'll understand that you don't, right? Because all of the rights that you have, well, some of us in the room were intended to be right bearers, right? If you're a white male, maybe own some land. If you're a woman, property. If you're black, you're definitely property. And all the rights that we have, none of them are self-executing, right? And that's something we have to be very honest about, because to your point, so often we have conversations about the ideals. The ideals of whom and for whom, right? And in what time and place and manner, as you just said, but also as the court loves to say before they take away another right. But I think it's important for us to do this because we don't have community knowledge about the facts that these rights have never been stable, right? And they've never been stable for most of the people in this room, and they still aren't stable today. I mean, we have just had a Supreme Court say, hey, it's not really your body anymore after a few weeks. So we're in a very, very strange place, but we act shocked because we have a short memory and we don't teach history well. right? But if we remembered, and if everyone could actually read a constitutional law case, we wouldn't be so surprised by the decisions that are coming out today.
Sandy.
Well, first of all, thank you all for this wonderful, really enlightening conversation. I just want to go back to the point raised by my friend Steve Trachtenberg a few minutes ago about, well, is it really worse in America than it is other places? And I thought that was a very effective answer about how much training America has done about this. But I think the real point here is that we purport to be better. We tell the world we're better. We tell the world we were founded as this great liberal democracy in a rebellion against monarchy, et cetera, et cetera. And when it turns out that we're not, it has tremendous consequences. Look at the demonstrations around the world about George Floyd. I mean, in a way that was absurd. Why should people in Europe or Asia be protesting about the killing of a man in the United States? Because when something happens like that in the United States, it's a scandal not only for the particular people committing the crime, but for the country and its international reputation. And so it does put a heavier burden on us, I think, but it's a self-inflicted burden that's put on us, because we say, do what we say, not necessarily do what we do.
Yeah, that's hard, because even answering this question is kind of meta, right? Or responding to this comment rather, because whose narrative is that? I mean, and also what I note when you say this is, I'm thinking about the protests that happened around the world after George Floyd, after Trayvon Martin, after, oh my goodness, Rodney King, I mean, on and on and on and on. I think the only people that have the idea of America as this place where things that don't happen are people that are relying on America to be a place this doesn't happen, right? People like me don't generally think that. They think that oftentimes America's better where than they're at, right? I have some friends that are from Sudan, that my stories are nothing compared to theirs, right? But then they come here, then they experience that ugly America too. So I think part of this is that we have a foreign policy strategy that we've always had about interest convergence, and we essentially put ourselves out to be an idealistic place where people can, where the reason people ally with us. But I think the reality is that for Black people in America, that's not the story. Black people in America never thought that this is the greatest liberal democracy in the world. You walk down the street and you ask people what they think about the United States, it's not going to be that, right? So I think there are narratives about the United States that get propped up, and there are narratives from faces at the bottom of the well that never get propped up. So it's hard to have the conversation, because who agrees with the narrative, right? And whose viewpoint are we talking about? But I think, of course, as from a point of statecraft, right, that's what we're doing. But I also note that, when we were thinking about, the early revolutions of the United States against the monarchy, when the United States was having these kind of slave rebellions, they were also happening in Haiti. And not because they're spontaneous, but because people are actually getting word across the ocean that there's this idea of freedom. So I think that what people do, and what people do with us, is they see themselves in the harm of George Floyd, not in the promise of the United States. And I think there is, to the point that you were making about policing, there is a familiar intimacy with the violence of the state that people see and are repelled by, but also are inspired by, because people are saying never again.
Anything else? Any other questions from the floor? Are we up to time? Okay, well, let's give our hand to our panelists here. Thank you very much.